Some of this should be reviewed from the Mexican introductory lecture. Mexican political culture is probably undergoing a more significant shift than any of the other countries that we're looking at. It's really been a transformation in the past 20 years. I think very exciting to look at, and I'm very glad that it's one of the countries being studied. However, the revolution of 1910 to 1917 is still a major source of legitimacy, however unrevolutionary any given set of Mexican rulers may be. They would still claim that legacy, and it remains an important way in which the Mexicans view themselves. Another important element of a Mexican political culture that I would argue is actually having a comeback is an authoritarian tradition, echoed particularly in a tradition of a strong presidency. Now, I think Peña Nieto's strong presidency is very different from that of the early 20th century PRI presidents. Nevertheless, his election and really the remarkable success he's enjoyed in pushing forward reforms that eluded the PAN presidents for the last 12 years, I think reflects, in fact, a Mexican taste for a president who can make things happen. In some ways, this is a little bit like the Russian acceptance of Putin, and like the long-term success of Putin will depend on the ability to deliver, which is still a question mark, of course, in the case of Peña Nieto, and I would argue a growing question mark in the case of Putin. Within the elites who had ruled through one-party rule through most of the 20th century, really through the 20th century, you did have fairly significant divisions. And in fact, you had a tendency for policy and control to shift back and forth. In the earlier part of the century, you had competing caudillos, basically strongman. And you also had a back and forth between populist leaders who relied very heavily on the support of the peasants and workers and leaders who were more closely allied with business. Later in the 20th century, the main division became between what were called politicos, the more traditional strongman rulers, and technicos. And this was a group, and again, talked about in the introductory podcast, that believed that Mexico needed to embrace significant reforms in order to succeed, and in particular needed to embrace globalization. This was the group that negotiated NAFTA and even more significantly instituted electoral reforms that eventually ended the monopoly of the PRI. So the interesting question mark now is whether the return to a strong presidency and the surprisingly widespread support for these reforms is a return to this tradition or just a temporary condition. Another important element in Mexican political culture, and something that the College Board loves to ask about, is a tradition of patron clientelism. This is actually a little bit like the Guangxi in China. Camarillas are basically networks of political allies, patron-client networks. They are still very powerful in the rural districts and in some city areas where you essentially have machine politics. Traditionally, they were used to mobilize voters, dole out favors, and the main form that political participation tended to take in Mexico was to stay in close ties, contact either with one's patron or with one's client, rather than to participate, in what we consider the more obvious ways, such as voting, joining interest groups, etc. This is very much changing. Mexico has a much more vibrant and active democracy now. Another element of Mexican political culture that I would argue is changing is machismo. Women didn't even get to vote until 1953. It was a very male-dominated system. In 2012, PAN's candidate was actually a woman. She didn't win, but that was still significant. PRI changed its electoral rules to require a large number of women legislative candidates. And in general, as we see in many countries across the world, as women acquire education, rise in the workforce, we're seeing more and more women legislators in Mexico. Finally, the close, often difficult, fraught relationship with the United States. Economic dependency on the United States is a way of life. But interestingly, and I actually should have put this on the slide, Right now, it may even be that the net movement of people and jobs is toward Mexico and not toward the United States. The U.S. economy has not performed as well in recent years. Crackdowns on deportation. Interesting little-known fact about the Obama administration is it's very much stepped up deportation of illegal immigrants, but also growing economic opportunities in Mexico. All of this may make the out-migration of population of the United States less of a factor in Mexican politics, at least for the next few years. That'll be very interesting to see. Okay, there are very significant cleavages in Mexico. Urban versus rural will remain a cleavage, but the urban percentage of the Mexican population continues to grow. When I updated this slide, that had gone up by another 10 percentage points almost. So you have 21 million people in the greater Mexico City area. 80% of the population lives in areas defined as urban. And by the way, something I didn't note here, but Mexico City dominates Mexican politics. To an extent that is not true really in the other countries we're saying. It's a very metropolitan system. Another important cleavage is mestizo, mixed race population versus Amerindian. Particularly in the South, you have states that are dominated by native people. Many are very disaffected. There have been significant revolts in this area, and generally speaking, they used to have ties with the PRI, have largely turned to the more left-wing PRD, but a lot of the mobilization of this group has actually been in the form of violent protest. Another political cleavage is young versus old. One of the things that really changed in 2000 when the PRI lost control, lost its political monopoly, is that younger, educated workers supported getting rid of the PRI and basically voted for PAN or the PRD. That is actually now much of that vote has changed to the PRD, and one of the interesting question marks with the PRI's revival is whether they can win over that youth vote, and particularly the more educated university students. My guess is that if economic prospects for university graduates improve under the PRI, that they'll get more of that vote. There's also been an increasingly significant youth protest vote, disaffection. By the way, exit polls show that Obrador, the PRD candidate, narrowly won the youth vote, and he won more among more educated youth. Again, I think that's whether or not that stays that way is an open question in Mexican politics. Finally, you have a cleavage between the educated and the uneducated. Educated voters have trended left, but again, I think it remains to be seen whether that's true if the economic reform policies that have now successfully passed in Mexico, I'll talk about that in a few minutes, turn out to improve economic prospects for young voters. The political cleavage that the College Board most likes to talk about is North versus South. Northern Mexico is richer, it's more urban, it's more dependent on trade with the U.S. Southern Mexico is more dominated by Amerindian populations, subtropical. The major industry in that area is really tourism, to a lesser extent, agriculture. And again, the southernmost state of Chiapas has been the locus of the Zapatista movement, which has often turned violent. This gives you a real sense of the political cleavages in the 2000 election, where PAN actually gained control of the presidency, which would hold for the next 12 years. And you notice that PAN's support is very much in the north. The PRI's is in more rural southern areas, and in that election, the PRD did not do particularly well. But let's look at the most recent election, and you notice that these northern states have switched and voted largely for PRI, and that is a very significant shift in the political divisions. It really reflects the fact that the northern voters were increasingly disaffected by what was seen as ineffectual government by PAN. And that's an important shift, and very much remains to be seen whether the PRI can hold on to those northern voters. Okay, the PRI, the Partido Revolucionario Institucional, and I apologize to those of you who can actually pronounce Spanish. I studied French in high school. It was founded basically by a group of elites in Mexico who thought that the tradition of basically choosing leaders by coups and revolts and inter-party violence or intergroup violence was undermining Mexico. And they wanted to come up with a way to work out conflicts through compromise, not violence. And it was really an extraordinarily successful one-party state that they established. There was very little division, really, between the party and the government. In this regard, it resembled China and Russia under United Russia to some extent. In fact, the United Russia parallel might be a better one. The PRI ran on a corporatist structure, and this is a term you really need to understand. It essentially is a system, and by the way, this was heavily rooted at the time in Catholic social theory. And the idea was that individuals participated in the political process largely through their interest groups. And so the PRI basically created and ran interest groups for peasant and labor organizations in particular. One very powerful one was the Teachers Union, remains powerful. I'll be talking about that. But there were business groups, and there was a very significant group of government workers. And these were not entirely undemocratic, but essentially they organized participation using the patron-client system. And to the extent that individuals participated in politics, they were much more likely to do it through their relevant interest group. In the rural area, you had a more traditional patron-client system where favors were exchanged for votes. And that remained intact a lot longer. And in many rural areas, is still in existence. And the question is whether it's dominated by the PRI or the PRD. In general, the PRI has supported activist centralized government. What it wants that government to do has actually changed dramatically at different points. It has not been ideologically consistent. There's a populist wing that favored strong government control over natural resources, redistribution of wealth. There was a more free market-oriented wing, which came into power in the late 20th century, and what I would argue is also in power under the current president, Peña Nieto. We'll get to that in a minute. But he also more significantly represents a return to the model of centralized presidentialism, a strongman presidency, someone who can get something done. There was a rebellion against that at the end of the 20th century that culminated in the 2000 election that threw the PRI out. The real question is whether the people just want to return to the old system, or what I think is more plausible is that the PRI has now reinvented itself as a Democratic Party, but has retained its reputation from being able to get things done. And I actually think at the first year and a half or so of the PRI regime has reinforced that image and made it look very successful. Again, we'll get there in a minute. So just to talk about how the PRI clawed back to power after losing the 2000 election, in the 2009 midterm election, the PRI gained a very significant number of seats, but that election also saw the beginning of a strong youth protest movement. In 2009, it took the form of the Voto en Blanco movement, none of the above. More than 10% of the ballots in Mexico City were turned in blank. One of the dilemmas facing the youth movement, and the real question mark, is whether it's going to be a protest movement or whether it's going to find a way to participate more actively in the political process and to find a party that it can work with. I mean, it's the logical union with at least the left-wing portion is with the PRD, but as you'll see in a minute, the PRD is itself going through divisions. Pardon me. In 2010, you also saw some movement for the PRI in terms of gubernatorial elections, but in fact it lost in larger states, and there was some question about whether the PRI would maintain its momentum, particularly in the face of a lot of election violence. And the answer is yes, they did very well in 2012, and that's where we're heading. But first, let me talk about the other two parties. The National Action Party, PAN, is actually an old party It was founded in the North and founded basically to represent business interests and also to reflect opposition to Mexico's, at the time, very strong anti-clerical, anti-religious movements. This is something you should have talked about in the introductory section, a long tradition of really warfare between the church and the state. By the way, this is largely ended. Recent elections have featured candidates from all of the parties very publicly attending church. There's been a rapprochement with the Catholic Church, and the anti-church element of Mexican politics is much less significant than it used to be. But again, strong ties to the Catholic Church and support for religious education is an important element of PAN. But PAN is not necessarily a right-wing party, and in particular, many members are attracted to sort of Christian socialism, are very committed to the idea of of social justice, etc. So PAN held the presidency from 2000 to 2012. And essentially failed to fulfill the promise of reform. It tried very hard. It had a reform program. In fact, I would argue, I think most commentators would argue, that what Peña Nieto did in 2013 and even the first month and a half of 2014 was enact PAN's legislative agenda with PAN's support, with a few exceptions. But basically, they were not able to effectively govern as a governing party. The Mexican left has had a hard time getting its act together. There were parties of the left of the PRI, particularly when the PRI turned in a more free market direction under the Technicos. But the PRD had a hard time unifying until Cardenas, the son of Mexico's most famous and revered president from the 1930s, a revered populist. He left the PRI feeling it inadequately addressed social justice, was not concerned enough about the urban and rural poor. In 1988, he won 31% of the official vote, and may, in fact, have won the popular vote. Many think that election was stolen. Won declining shares in 1994 and 2000. In 2006, and again in 2012, the standard bearer was López Obrador. He had been a popular mayor of Mexico City, very much a strong man, some would say a thug. When he lost very narrowly in 2006, although most observers seem to think it was a narrow but fair election, he and his supporters took to the streets. Interestingly enough, the effect of that seemed to be to reduce support for PRD and Obrador. Basically, Mexico was moving in the direction of democracy, and there was a feeling that he was attempting to return it to the old ways under the PRI. The supporters of the PRD tend to be younger. They tend to be politically active, often from the central states. They have some education. Big question mark, as I've mentioned, over the future of Mexican politics is who gets the more educated youth vote. If they're going to succeed in the future in taking the presidency, actually PRD has never won the presidency, they're going to need to get more votes from the rural poor, taking that away from PRI, and they're going to have to persuade a larger portion of the Mexican voting population that they're not dangerous. And the tendency for PRD supporters to take to the streets when they don't get their way undermines that in a country that is attempting to modernize and is priding itself on a move toward democracy. This is going to be even more complicated by the fact that Obrador, there's been a lot of new infighting within the party, and just last month in January 2014, Obrador left the PRD to found a new leftist party. Whether that party is successful, whether it's just the last gasp of an aging leftist, it remains to be seen. I am going to get to the 2012 election, but I want to talk briefly about Mexico's very complicated electoral system. By the way, careful about this on the AP exam. AP exams are written over Labor Day weekend. The people writing the exam would have been well aware that there were proposals for some significant changes in the electoral system, but they had not yet passed. They've just very recently passed the legislature. Essentially, in 1986, PRI passed an election reform law that was intended to give the impression of multi-party democracy without really creating its reality. And to a large extent, it backfired. It made it very difficult for any party to achieve a governing majority. And as we'll see in a few minutes, it was really only after the 2012 election when PRI came back in power and cut a series of deals with the opposition parties, essentially ran a kind of coalition government that major legislative reforms have been possible. But the system is that each state elects 3 senators, 2 are majority vote, and then the third is the party that received the second highest number of votes. This, again, was to make sure that there were some opposition party candidates in the Senate, but it's helped contribute to gridlock. And then an additional 32 Senate seats are elected nationally through proportional representation. By the way, you're unlikely to have to know all of these picky details for the AP exam, but you do need to know that it's a mixture of first past the post and proportional representation. The lower house, 300 seats are chosen by a single member district plurality, first past the post system, and 200 by proportional representation. Is that complicated enough for you? Again, this was a reform designed to create a certain amount of non-PRI representation and helped produce ungovernable legislatures because you couldn't get a legislative majority. And in fact, PRI still does not have a legislative majority in spite of its successful ability to pass legislation in the last 16 months or so. Legislators are chosen every 3 years, members of the Chamber of the Deputy. Like the president, they are not allowed to serve in consecutive terms. That has changed, but it only changed very recently. I hope the College Board is paying attention to how it phrased those questions. And this is the thing that's been really tricky. No party is allowed more than 300 seats, and no party's share of seats can exceed more than 8% of its share of the national vote. Now, I did not see any analysis of the recent legislative reforms that indicated that this had changed, but I wonder if that's right. At any rate, you won't have to worry about it, and by the time I get around to doing an update next year, with luck, I will have been able to see something more detailed about this. The real question is whether these new election rules, which I'll be talking about, will be a game changer. The electoral system for the presidency has not changed. It's a 6-year term, the sexenio. Traditionally, the candidate was chosen by what was called the Didazzo system. Basically, there was a bargaining among the party elite. A successor was named, and then that successor would become the president. Zedillo, my favorite PRI president, my hero, replaced it with a primary election. And in 2006, this produced a huge surprise. Vicente Fox, the president, the PAN president, that was 2000 was the election where PRI lost the presidency, had a candidate, and he did not win the primary. So the president did not, in fact, get to use Didazzo to choose the successor. And I think that was a very important precedent. It remains to be seen what will happen. By the way, it's a winner-take-all plurality vote, the Mexican election. There is no runoff. Generally speaking, you're looking at a 3-way contest, and it means that you do not have as a rule in Mexican politics, at least up until now, it'll be interesting to see if that changes, a president who has a majority vote of the population. So, the 2014 electoral reforms, these just passed in January 2014. They were designed to improve chances for significant legislative action, but they were also insisted upon by PAN as a condition of supporting Peña Nieto's reform. So beginning in 2018, the winning party in a presidential election will be able to form a coalition government. Again, this is a recognition that given the current party system in Mexico, the 3-party system, it's going to be impossible to have a majority president. A coalition government would create the possibility of a genuine majority government. Right now, essentially, Mexico is being run by a PRI PAN coalition, with a few exceptions, as we'll see tax reform passed with PRD support. If a coalition government is formed, the Senate will have to approve all cabinet appointments except for the Defense and Navy secretaries. Again, this doesn't happen until the next election. It'll be very interesting to see how this plays out. This is a very significant change, but it isn't taking place yet. There's a new National Electoral Institute. You'll recall that a electoral institute was a major part of the reforms that led to the, groundbreaking 2000 election. What's significant here is that this will regulate state as well as national elections. In many ways, the old caudillo system is alive and well in several of the states. Senators can now be reelected for up to 2 consecutive 6-year terms, and lower house lawmakers for up to 4 consecutive 3-year terms. Critics of Mexican politics have long argued that one of the reasons it's such a presidential system is that you don't have continuity. Now, in fact, you tended to have legislators moving in and out of the legislature, but this is going to allow potentially for a more powerful counterbalancing legislature. And again, too early to know how this will turn out, but it could be significant. The president and governors are still limited to a single 6-year term. So, key elections, this slide is pretty self-explanatory. It's really there for your review. What's important to note is that the PRI wins all of these elections, but in the 1990s, the PRI comes on hard times. There's the peasant revolt. There's the assassination of the PRI candidate. There's an earthquake. There are some looser controls over the media. There are electoral reforms, this creation of an electoral institute. And you have a movement. I'm not sure if I have this here. I should have. You have some states being taken over by other parties, in particular states that are run by the PAN, which is how Vicente Fox gains the government experience. It helps him win the presidential election in 2000. That's a very important election. You need to know that. So what happens? The voters are angry at the PRI. There's economic decay, rising crime, lots of evidence of corruption, and it's kind of embarrassment that Mexico has been a one-party state for almost an entire century. You also had major electoral reforms. You had this new federal election agency, which by most accounts did a very conscientious job. And I think it's very interesting that it was a PRI president, Zedillo, who instituted this. And I think he actually realized that the PRI needed to lose power, or at least to have the potential to lose power for Mexico to move forward. And the success of the current PRI government is really a vindication of his strategy. You also had some significant campaign finance reform, and, I guess I did have it here, divided government at state levels. So Vicente Fox, the PAN candidate, wins in 2000. For the first time, the PRI does not control the presidency. Notice, although he wins quite substantially, that he is not a majority candidate, and the PRI retained control of the legislature. So you had, and at this point, the PRI is just pissed. They've been in control for a very long time, are not interested in cooperating with PAN to pass legislation that's needed. Very little gets accomplished in the first set of midterm elections. PAN loses even more seats, and basically gridlock sets in. In 2006, the PAN candidate wins by a very narrow majority, but PRI gets only 22% of the vote. PRI, at this point, they run a very traditional old-line strongman sort of candidate. Obrador, the PRD candidate, comes very close. As you can see how close that was, although, as I said, commentators who looked at the election results tend to think, the experts tend to think it was a fair, if very narrow victory. Obrador refuses to accept it, and there are riots, particularly in several states. His protesters essentially shut down business. And one interesting effect of this is to discredit Obrador and to increase Calderon's support. So polls 6 months after the election show a much larger margin of support for him. There was a gain for PAN, bigger gain for PRD in the legislative election. In 2009, however, you have a significant gain for the PRI, and it's in 2009 that you really see the PRI beginning its big comeback. Okay, 2012 election. This was July 2012. Basically, the PRI has successfully rebranded itself, and it's trying to build on both its reputation for being able to get things done, because PAN has been able to accomplish relatively little of its own agenda in 12 years. It has its strong grassroots organization still, but has essentially at least appeared to embrace democracy. The candidate is the former governor of the state of Mexico. That's where Mexico City is, Mexico's most populous state. Again, very important support base for any president. Charismatic guy, married to a popular telenovela actress. At the time, there was a little bit of speculation that he was a blow-dry candidate, too weak. He has turned out to be an extremely powerful and effective president in his first year and a half in office. So you're not hearing a lot of talk about just the television candidate. He benefited from the fact that Obrador was not viewed as a reliably democratic candidate. He was the only major candidate who actually had a negative approval rating. A lot of skepticism about Obrador's support for democracy. He had been a popular mayor of Mexico City, but had used kind of strongman tactics, lots of mob rule. The PAN candidate was a woman, which was significant. But at this point, there was a pretty widespread feeling that somebody else needed to turn in office. This is not unlike what happens in American politics when, parties don't tend to remain in office forever. Voters begin to think somebody else deserves a chance to mess up their time. So there are the three candidates. That's Obrador on the left, the PAN candidate in the middle, the new president on the right. Here are the election results. As you'll see, it was a fairly significant victory for Peña Nieto. Obrador challenged that, and in fact, there were protests against this election. I'll talk about it in a minute, but the margin of victory, at least statistically, was significantly greater than in 2006. In the Senate, the PRI gained 19 seats, and the other two parties lost. But in the Chamber of Deputies, the PRI lost a significant number of seats. Oops, thought I'd fix that slide. PAN lost 28, PRD gained 41, so the Chamber of Deputies moved more toward the PRD, but you'll notice that PAN still had the largest section. No party has a legislative majority, which is why nothing happened to speak of between 2000 and 2012. Stay tuned. So in the aftermath of the election, there are huge protests. The election was closer than polls had predicted. Obrador again challenged the results. There were protests across the country led by the youth movement, and there were more serious allegations of fraud than there had been in the 2006 election. There were a lot of pictures that circulated on YouTube and in social media of stuffed, pre-marked ballots being stuffed, and there's little doubt that at least some of that happened. And a big scandal, the PRI had spent millions of dollars, pesos, on the supermarket credit cards. Allegedly, these were given out to party workers for expenses, but it was widely viewed as a bribe, sort of returned to the PRI's old style. Here's a picture of the protests in Mexico City. Nevertheless, not too long afterwards, things really settled down. There was a pretty widespread acknowledgement that even if there had been some fraud, that even if you could eliminate all the fraudulent votes, that the PRI candidate had pretty clearly won the election. And again, Obrador's willingness to take to the streets and essentially shut down day-to-day business in many places angered voters, or it angered, other than the protesters, it angered a lot of ordinary Mexicans, and probably, again, undermined the PRD. Now, the day after the election, the president unveils what he calls the Pact for Mexico. He had had the leaders of PAN and PRD, not Obrador, by the way, it was a party leader, sign a document committing to major reforms in telecommunications, in education, in finance, and especially in energy. That should have been on the list here. PAN, in particular, insisted on adding electoral reform to the list. Now, at the time, this was statements of principle. Would anything really happen? But it was an acknowledgement that the pattern of 2000 to 2012, where everyone acknowledged that Mexico needed reforms in order to really move into the 21st century, but nothing happened. The big question mark was always PRD support. Obrador did not support the Pact for Mexico, but now that he's broken away to form his own party, the PRD, as we're about to see, went along with it. This is a chart from the Wall Street Journal that indicates that basically Peña Nieto's strategy was to govern as a coalition president. He just had different coalitions for different initiatives. So changing the electoral system, both PON and PRD wanted it. The energy change had been the centerpiece of PON's policy program since 2000, and they'd got nowhere with it. And the huge issue in the Mexican economy was the fact that the energy sector has been doing very poorly. Almost everyone acknowledged that the government energy monopoly, Pemex, was undercapitalized, was run through cronyism, that there was very little technological development. Oil companies were eager to come in and develop Mexico's oil resources, but without any guarantee that they could, keep their own profits or have any control over the production under the Mexican Constitution. They were unwilling. That needed to be reformed, but the idea that that the energy sector was run by the government, that it was the patrimony of the Mexican people, was deeply rooted in Mexican legitimacy. It was going to be difficult to change. There was a widespread understanding that the tax policy needed to revamp. The wealthy needed to pay more, but in general, more tax revenue needed to be raised if the social safety net would be retained. There was also huge anger. I don't think this one is up here at the telecommunications system. The government-run telephone index, the government monopoly, large monopolies on television had resulted in very high telecommunications costs and too little competition in Mexico. So these were the things. Oh, and education. Well, we'll get there. So amazingly enough, basically between June 2013 and just the last couple of weeks, Mexico has passed an extraordinary set of reform bills. In June 2013, there was a major overhaul of telecommunications, which required necessary constitutional reforms. It's a new regulatory body that is empowered to break up monopolies. Now, in the past, the two big media companies, I'll get to that in a minute in my media slide, have maintained a stranglehold over media, partly because they have successfully litigated in court to block any kinds of changes. There's still a question mark about whether this law will, in fact, enable it to break up. But the reason much of it was enshrined in the Constitution was an effort to avoid basically crony courts. And the Mexican judiciary is very problematic for being basically in the pockets of these big state-owned enterprises. But generally speaking, given the success of these other reforms and widespread Mexican anger at their high cable and telephone costs, I think there's a good chance that this reform is going to go through. Another huge reform is education. The teachers' union has been an extremely powerful force in Mexico. And please don't think this is just an anti-teacher union diatribe. We're talking about a union that in Mexico is largely Marxist. There have been a number of reported cases where teachers actually participated in Marxist guerrilla groups kidnapping of children. The teachers union completely ran the certification and hiring process. They ran their own universities. Teaching jobs were inherited, were bought and sold. They are a valuable job, particularly in rural, poor areas. And Mexico's education was consistently ranked toward the bottom of more developing countries. Widespread feeling that this needed to be changed, that there needed to be some outside evaluation of teachers. The head of the teachers union was widely believed to be very corrupt, partly because of all her mansions in California. By the way, she was successfully arrested on corruption charges. That was part of the reform. But most significantly, there was an education reform bill that introduced mandatory teacher evaluations and independent teacher training. The question mark here is what will happen in several states that are essentially controlled politically by the teachers union. There's been speculation that PRI government won't even try to institute education reforms in those states. But Peña Nieto has stated very strongly that that's not going to be the case. This is a real question mark over the future of Mexican reform proposals. And it's also going to be, I think, a dilemma for PRD, because the places where the most corruption exists in education, where there's, where you have very bad educational results, not well-educated teachers who essentially inherit their jobs, have been in the poorer areas. If the education reform is successful and there's better educational opportunities as a result for poor Mexican children, it'll be interesting to see what happens to PRD, because Obrador allied very closely with the protesting teachers' unions. It's also the question about whether the state will be able to handle the inevitable teacher strikes. The tradition was in many of these southern Mexico states, the teacher strikes would regularly shut down school for a couple of months of the school year every year. So again, that's going to be a challenge for Mexico. In October 2013, there was a major tax reform bill. This was the one legislative change that was passed with PRD support. It increased taxes on the wealthy. It instituted for the first time a capital gains tax, that is, tax on the appreciation of stock and other assets. But it also raised the VAT, the value-added tax, really the sales tax equivalent. By the way, it was particularly increased on sugary and caloric foods, as Mexico is undertaking a major fight against childhood obesity, a la New York City. Many of these VAT changes are going to fall heavily on the poor, but this is going to raise more tax revenue from wealthier Mexicans. So it'll be interesting to see how that goes. But by far the most significant reform was that in December 2013, the long-sought energy reform bill passed. This is a huge development in Mexican politics. It altered the Constitution. It ended a central feature of the Mexican Constitution, which was that all natural resources were the property of the Mexican people, therefore the Mexican government, and that state monopolies would run these businesses. It allowed non-Pemex companies to compete for oil exploration licenses, to enter oil production, and most significantly, to own and sell the products of that exploration. There's still a lot of government control, and Pemex still has certain preferences in terms of exploration, so it very much remains to be seen how this is going to be implemented. It also overhauled the generation, distribution, and sale of electricity, breaking up another state monopoly that had raised costs. This could be a huge economic boon for Mexican industry. Interestingly, the question here is this just a return to the old presidential model? The president says something's going to happen and it happens? Or is it a sign that Mexico is figuring out how to effect political change within its rather weird electoral and legislative system? I'm hoping it's the latter. I'm very, very encouraged by these changes. I admit, personally, I think they're moves in the right direction. You might disagree, but at any rate, they seem to have broken the legislative gridlock. I recommend that some of these congressmen who like to take jaunts go south and see how in Mexico City they actually managed to accomplish something. There are big policy issues still hanging over Mexico. Drug crime remains a huge problem. Peña Nieto ran partly against Calderón's very aggressive use of the military against drug crimes, wanted to return to more use of police. In fact, he has retained the federal government's strong involvement, even the military's involvement. What's interesting and the most important development, there's been a rise of vigilante citizen groups. Now, some people argue they're just allied with rival drug gangs, but essentially you had more and more citizens taking arms against the drug dealers, or at least against the drug dealers that they didn't like. And the PRI has essentially formed an informal alliance with some of these vigilante groups. This is very controversial and obviously very dangerous, but the control of swaths of Mexico by drug gangs, is a terrifying problem, and it's very hard to see how the state's going to move forward until it can address that problem more successfully. Moving into 2014, I've talked about all this major legislative change. Nevertheless, economic growth was sluggish and disappointing in 2013. There's a great deal of hope, obviously, that these 2014 reforms, particularly in the energy sector, will turn out to be an economic boon. In addition, the PRI government is instituting a major stimulus program, infrastructure investments, etc. Remains to be seen whether big budget deficits are a problem in the future. Now, I'm just going to hit a couple more topics that the College Board might care about. Note that voter turnout is consistently around 65% in Mexico, pretty high, dropped down in 2003 and 2009 because those are midterm elections. For some reason, this doesn't have 2006. I'm not sure why. Oh, you know what? I wonder if all of these saying July 1st, 2012, I guess those are for the presidential, legislative, and senatorial elections. I'm sorry. I should have looked at that slide more carefully before I put it up. I took it from the Economist, or actually, I think I took it from the Economist. But at any rate, turnout is about 65%, which is what you should know. Linkage institutions, I mentioned already that the PRI essentially created corporatist linkage institutions, and these were wholly owned subsidiaries of the party. Salinas reduced their role. There was a feeling that they were a source of corruption, but they also were failing to deliver votes reliably. Some other important linkage institutions. You have business groups that have been very powerful, particularly within PAN. You have the Catholic Church, as I mentioned. Anti-clerical, anti-church sentiment is not as politically popular as it was earlier in Mexico, and Catholics are more able to participate in government as Catholics. I talked about the teachers' union as a powerful and radical force. One of the interesting questions there, by the way, is that the unions completely controlled the hiring process. I mean, there was nothing like state school boards or state offices of education. The union said, these are the teachers, the schools, these are the ones you have to hire. There's a lot of evidence that many teachers were unhappy with this system and the very large amount of dues that they had to give to the teachers union, and that they were fired if they didn't participate in protests. So one of the questions will be what happens with teachers if some of the union control is broken. You have more neighborhood and civic groups. I used to tell the story, I don't know if this came up from the first podcast. One of my favorite stories about Mexico is during the earthquake, PRI's ineffective response to the earthquake. And I'm forgetting the year of the earthquake. My apologies. But the PRI's inadequate response was a major reason that it lost support and power. But there was a great story that came out of this. A hospital collapsed. And the neonatal unit, actually that means the place where all the newborn babies were, was buried in the rubble, but it wasn't clear. There was some evidence that there might still be structurally supported. In other words, that the babies inside it might be alive. The PRI government says, look, there's just nothing we can do about it. We can't get in there. So a group of engineering students from a university in Mexico City got together, figured out how to tunnel into the hospital, and they rescued all the babies. They got very good press for that. Interestingly enough, many of them went on to be hired by the PRI. They were not completely stupid about co-opting opposition groups. Youth movements so far have focused more on protests. There's a lot of disaffection. This vote blanco, just don't vote movement may satisfy the showing that they're pissed off side, but is not an effective form of political participation in the long run. So it's a big question mark over Mexican politics. Will the youth figure out a way to participate through the party system? Media, PRI completely controlled mass media. There was some deregulation in the 1990s. One of the reasons PAN was able to win that election, but there has still been this monopoly of Televisa and TV Azteca. Widespread dissatisfaction with that. You have this new law, new regulatory agency aimed at breaking that up. Remains to be seen what will happen with that. There could be a huge shakeup and a real change in the Mexican media market, so stay tuned.